we are going just for those who were not able to make it. Right. As I was saying, so Suzanne returned to the private sector to mobilize communities to end human trafficking after culminating her bureau career by receiving the Director's Award for Excellence from the FBI Director, Christopher Wray. She is considered a specialist in her field, and we are very appreciative and grateful to have her joining with us. Her focus is crimes against children, civil rights, and to train and educate communities on behalf of the FBI. She is also now the CEO of No More Trafficking and the founder of Uncaged Canaries. She works in collaboration with people everywhere, from every sector, to deliver accurate information about human trafficking, provide collaborative community solutions, and empower those who have been exploited and voiceless to find freedom and to rise to fulfill their potential. What I really loved about the bio that Suzanne sent is this last little bit where she attributes every success in her life to the last 4 words of the oath she swore to become an FBI agent. So help me God. Recognizing that every accomplishment has been a result of miracles showing up through people who have walked alongside her at every stage. So Suzanne, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Just, sorry, quickly before I do that, just some Zoom etiquette, please. If you are not speaking, can you please mute your mic? But we would also love to see your face. So if you could please turn on your video so we can see you. And then if you do have a question, you're welcome to just raise a hand or pop it in the chat box and one of our team will give you the floor. All right, Suzanne, without any further ado, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really do believe that this is one of the major keys to ending all forms of human trafficking and child exploitation. That is just having the conversations and for us to come together and have conversations based on what is true. There's been a lot of sensationalized information about trafficking. There's been a lot of media coverage. There have been movies. There's stuff that goes viral on social media. There's people who tell stories about their child was almost kidnapped and trafficked by this suspicious person they saw somewhere, or what happened online. But a lot of that stuff isn't true. We know that truth is rock solid. There is one truth that doesn't change. And we know that from bringing perspective together. And we can only bring perspective together when we bring all of our lenses together. And, you know, it struck me, I have my sunglasses, had my sunglasses sitting here, and there's this lens, there's a filter, and we all look through a filter. And so we're not seeing clearly, but when we put those pictures together, what we see individually, we can kind of circumvent, walk around and get a fuller picture of what's going on and have a clearer view. And so that's really what I did. I feel like as an FBI agent, one of the unique pieces that I can bring to the conversation is I saw behind the scenes and I got to gather lots of perspectives. That's essentially what it was to work a case. If any of you out there are in enforcement, in journalism, you do that to a degree. Sometimes you'll tell a person's story, but you can't make a case based on just somebody telling the story. You have to corroborate that. And you're looking at what are different accounts, what are different places that I can collect information from. And then you're putting that together to find truth, to find the full picture. And for me, I would often say that working a human trafficking investigation was like trying to put a puzzle together. But normally, you know, if I worked a lot of different things. We were talking a little bit before we started, and I was asked that question, well, did you only focus on human trafficking? No, I feel like one of the great benefits I had was because of the FBI office where I worked, I got to investigate a lot of things. Human trafficking intersects with all of the things. So if we focus too narrowly on trafficking, we miss it. What if I was, say, responding to a bank robbery? I knew from the get-go what the crime was that had been committed. I knew probably whether the suspect was armed or not. I knew how much cash they had taken. There were witnesses in the bank, and there was probably some surveillance video. Trafficking cases don't look like that. At the onset, you may not even know that it's trafficking. And that's for an investigator, where I had investigations that started off as something else. And then we recognized it as trafficking. In fact, that was what happened with one of my most famous cases. The headlines went global, but from the beginning, folks did not recognize it as trafficking. There were other crimes. And then as we put the pieces together, we pursued a federal case, 3-week trial, and put the offenders in federal prison for a long time. But that's the complexity of it. Trafficking is so messy. What I feel like I recognized both as an FBI agent and as a person of faith while I was working as an agent, conducting all sorts of investigations, and then coming to focus most specifically on trafficking, I was reading my Bible cover to cover, and I found evil's a real thing. First of all, I got a firsthand look at that. Evil's primary weapon is deception. And so that's the weapon that traffickers use, whether they mean to or not. They create false narratives. So intentionally, the trafficking will often look like something else. And that's also what has happened in we can call the anti-trafficking movement, that there are some things where the narrative is not quite accurate. And a lot of times what you'll see portrayed is these sensationalized accounts where children are suddenly abducted. And the reality is trafficking very rarely starts like that. It starts out subtly. You think about, again, that false narrative, a pretend picture that hides what's really going on. And this is the case no matter what platform you're on. It could be up close in person, or it could be online. Trafficker tactics generally are the same. It's often easier online because if you're online, you can pretend to be anyone that you want to be. I've seen that repeatedly in investigations where somebody would pretend to be a child and go online and befriend other children. And really, it's not a child at all. It's an adult who's much older. And then they would entice this child to send new photographs. And then they use those photographs to hold over their head to move that relationship from online to the physical. That's pretty extreme. That doesn't happen a ton. Sometimes that turns to trafficking. Sometimes it turns to other sorts of extortion. That is a grave risk to our children these days. It's you've probably seen the headlines where children have committed suicide because they've been threatened with those pictures being exposed if they don't send money or if they don't commit additional acts. That is coercion, and that is trafficking. The definition of trafficking, when I boil it down, there's lots of different laws, and the laws in different countries are not exactly the same. But when I boil it down, what I am talking about is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some sort of work. We often will talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking as if they are different things, but what I have seen is, practically speaking, the only difference is the type of work. Now, when you're looking at children, particularly in the United States, I'm not certain what all of your laws are, but in the United States, federally, and then each of our 50 states have their own laws as well, and in different places. But if you're talking about the sex trafficking of a child, you don't need, under the law, to prove force, fraud, or coercion because a child can't consent to those acts. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about human trafficking. Those trafficker tactics, as I said, same. If they're online or if they're in person, it is the deception. There's the extreme example I've told you about with the extortion and the threats. That's blatant, and you can recognize it if you see that as an observer, or if someone comes to you and has the courage to tell you that that is what is happening. Typically, traffickers are more subtle. One of the dangers of the internet, you know, it's opened a lot of doors and we're connected through that. Like that's a great gift, but at the same time, there are great dangers that have come. And I will often say social media is like an online shopping mall for predators. Someone can go online, predators, traffickers prey on vulnerabilities. They can go online and they can find somebody who's vulnerable. We all have vulnerabilities. They can identify those through social media. So often kids will post on their social media accounts, not thinking that the whole world is watching, or even just that one dangerous person is watching. But they will post about what it is that their heart desires or what it is that they need. So they might be mad at their parents. They may have broken up with their boyfriend or their girlfriend. They may need money. They may need a place to stay. All of these things are vulnerabilities where somebody can come in and pose as the solution. Or even more scary, somebody may come in intending to be the solution, and they may even offer some sort of remedy to that need, but then it goes off track and becomes exploitive over the course of time, because that's also the sad reality of humanity is traffickers prey on others. But to some degree, we've all used these tactics of manipulation, deception, fear motivation. These are part of our culture, the creating of false narratives. And sometimes we will even decide, consciously or not, that the ends justifies the means. The problem is those means, when we accept them, can groom somebody for a predator. It's really much more challenging to identify the fake, the fraud, the predator when we see these tactics being used all around us. We so often want the simple solution and we want to swoop in and save the day. That works with the first example that I gave you, and it works on the rare occasion of the sudden abduction and then trafficking. But typically, as I said, it's much more subtle. And so we need to be really intentional in our culture, in our workplaces, in our households about how we treat each other, the conduct that we model, the way we do business, so that those who are vulnerable will recognize when they're being treated in an unhealthy way, so that we'll recognize when we're being treated in an unhealthy way. So if you have that person who's coming in and posing as the solution, they make a connection with somebody online, and then over time, that relationship moves from online to real life. Typically, those who are being trafficked don't know that they're being trafficked. So one of the questions I will often get is, well, how do I get them to tell me? They're never going to tell you if they don't know. And they're never going to use those words if they don't know. And even if they do know, you know, lots of us don't really want to be victims. We don't want that to be part of our story. And so I will also caution, let's use the words that people are comfortable with. It may be victim. This is also the flip side of it. The victim can be an empowering word. There are lots in the anti-trafficking movement who want only to use the word survivor. I think we should use that word if that's the word folks want to use. However, I will also tell you in my own story, when somebody came to me and said, Suzanne, you're the victim, that was an empowering word, because what that said was, I don't have to just survive or endure this anymore, but that this can change and this should change, because victim is it's a legal term. And it says something is not as it should be. This needs to change. And so that's the mess of it and the complexity of it. So another question I'll often get is, what are the hotspots to avoid, whether that be physical location or online location? And you may already know this. This is bad news. Predators, traffickers go where children go. They go where the vulnerable go. So wherever kids are spending their time, that's where the traffickers are. So sometimes there will be a particular app or a website that gets particular attention, and then law enforcement will take it down and folks will proclaim victory. That happened here in the States with Backpage. I think 99 out of 100 senators celebrated the great work they did to end trafficking. But do you know what happened? And many of us in law enforcement, I was in law enforcement at the time, predicted this. It drove the traffickers underground to places where it was harder to collect the evidence, and to chase down those leads. So again, it is complex and they just move. And so what we really need to focus on is those trafficker tactics, and then what are the tools to combat those trafficker tactics. So one, equipping our children, equipping ourselves to recognize, what does healthy relationship look like? We can always be on the lookout for the suddenly and the violence. The way trafficking is often portrayed, the way even my cases were portrayed with extreme violence, it happens where people were locked up, beat up, held at gunpoint. It did not typically start like that. It started with something else and degraded over time. And so one of the absolute most important things we can do, in addition to being intentional about modeling healthy relationship, is ensuring that we and those we care about have communities surrounding them. Going back to the lenses that we look through, we want people with different lenses so that they can give us feedback. That's what I have intentionally put into place for my kids. It's what we did in a professional context and continue to do for kids who are vulnerable in our community. When we would recognize that someone was trafficked, there was a team that came together from the professional sector. So for my own kids, what I have prayed for and intentionally identified is those people who can surround them, whether it's friends, parents, folks in different parts of their life. And I have found when they got old enough to go to work, that often it was the workplace dynamics. And for those of us that have worked in different sorts of places, can make all the difference in the world. It is such an extraordinary opportunity to mentor somebody, because people spend so much time there. And all of those places, then people with different perspectives, providing feedback and being in a place where they can say something if somebody's coming in and poses a danger that maybe a child's not going to see themselves. So often it's educators and it's the folks in schools. And I know we ask so much of our teachers, and we ask them to be superhumans, just kind of like we do with law enforcement. But teachers are in such a pivotal, important place to recognize when there's something concerning happening, and to be in a position to maybe speak up and say something. It is the collectively that makes the difference. It's not one person. Even in my casework, and you heard it in the bio, it's not one person who comes in and saves the day. It's the community. So when we all are faithful in doing our part, that is what is really going to make a difference. And I think we're in a place where I see the tide ready to change, where we hear a lot of horror stories about the ugly things, but I see people who are ready to do their part and bring a shift. So I'm excited about that. The narrative on human trafficking needs to change, and we all recognize it, right? That's why we're here having this conversation. I think I want to give you one more example, and then maybe I'll toss it back to you if you want to just continue the dialogue, and I'll answer any questions and focus wherever you want me to focus. But I'll often receive messages from friends who are sending me different headlines and letting me know how outraged and sick they are over the things. And one of the ones that was sent to me was about a major sporting event. A teenager had been abducted from the bathroom, was what the headline said. And My friend was just absolutely outraged. How could this have happened? What is wrong with it? Wasn't as much about, I mean, obviously that the child was abducted, right? There was a kidnapper and that was terrible. We know that. But there was this outrage about all of the bystanders and nobody did anything. And I remember seeing that and thinking, I'll bet that's not how it unfolded. If that child had been suddenly snatched from the bathroom, I believe somebody would have stopped it, and they certainly would have called law enforcement, even if they didn't step in. And as time went on, the story began to emerge. My suspicion was true, which was that this child had connected with somebody online. There was already a plan that was made to meet that person. And this child did, in fact, go with that person. And then what was reported over the course of time is that they had been taken to a different geography, which that's not necessary for it to constitute trafficking. There doesn't need to be smuggling across borders or from one town to another. My most famous case all happened in one location. But in this instance, there had been that plan to meet with, a potential date. And then that date turned into a trafficker. And that child probably had some vulnerabilities that allowed this person to come in. And that child was willing to go because they were usually, when children run, they're running from something. So was it a kidnapping? Yes, under the law it was, but it wasn't a child that was taken at gunpoint. It wasn't a child that was physically forced at that time, but it was a situation that degraded over the course of time because there was a vulnerability. And so that headline and the story that was told that then instilled all this fear in people and taught them to watch for the wrong thing, that was a false narrative. So we have to look at what's really going on behind the scenes to protect our kids and ourselves. So I will hand it back to you.
Yeah, just to open the floor. So if anyone has any questions, you're welcome just to unmute yourself and ask Suzanne.
Hi, Caitlin, Mati here. I'm not sure if I can speak. I'm struggling to find my hand on the screen. So this question, I would like to pose it to Suzanne with regards to, you mentioned that online traffickers like to spend time with children or like to, basically an example, TikTok. As we know that our children are spending a lot of time on TikTok. So as an aunt, a sister, a mother, what prevention advice would you give me to give to other people? Because we know that TikTok has taken the world by storm, and we are not really, some of us don't really know how it works, and the Gen Zs know how this platform works. So how can you help us to make sure that our children are safe online? Just to share some advice.
Yes. So that is one of the great challenges, is kids know more than we do, right? Like, generally speaking, they're always going to be further ahead than we are with whatever the new thing is. And right now it is TikTok. There seem to be some themes, no matter what the platform is, and some just general cautions that we can give, which, first of all, we need to tell our children not to give away their physical location, their address, any of that online. It stands to reason, but they continue to do it. Sometimes they won't use their real name online, but they'll use a name that has clues in it. So we want to watch for those things and talk to them and train them not to do that stuff. I used to tell parents, watch your kids' social media accounts. You want to, if it's a platform where you can friend them, you want to be friends with them. You want to be really intentional about laying down some ground rules before you let them go online. For my kids, they were probably older than most of their peers when I allowed them to do that. At the same time, this is where the world is interacting. And so isolation is a trafficker tactic. It creates a vulnerability because we're made for connection. And if we cut kids off from the world, because that's one of the temptations when we hear about all the dangers, is we want to protect them from everything. But that actually can bait us into creating a vulnerability to traffickers. And so we have to find the balance. And in my opinion, it is better to let them take on increasing independence in those things when we are still there as a presence and a safeguard. It's not going to be maybe the same for every child when they have different levels of access to social media. The best advice I can give is not to directly connect message with anybody online that you do not know in person. I believe that should be a rule for our children. If you're going to do that, if we're going to let them do that, then there should be an adult who is supervising all of those communications. And then we need to teach them it is going to happen. They are going to be contacted by people who are up to no good, because there are people who will just get online and they will just send message after message after message until somebody responds to that. Sometimes they're sending nude pictures. They will do that to our kids. And so we need to be aware of that, because our kids are going to see things that we can't stop it once they're allowed to go into that space. And so we also need to create a safe space for them to have the conversation when that does happen. If we're going to let them go into those spaces, we need to know it's not a question of if, but when. If you are living life online, this is what's going to happen. One of the common schemes that predators will use also. So I said we don't want to let anybody in that we don't know in real life. But one of the things folks will do is it could be any platform that allows for some sort of friending and forming of groups. Is somebody will find one child who's part of a group, and then they'll start to friend all of the other folks who are part of that group. And so it looks like, oh, that's a safe person because all of my friends know this person, where that's not really the case. But once they work their way in, they gain some credibility and some legitimacy. Also, there are sometimes internal systems that are password protected. So it might be a business, but it might be school. Those are usually locked down a little more. Churches, you want to think that that's a safe space, but often some of the larger churches in particular, where we don't know everybody, they'll have internal directories. And so we have seen where somebody will get into those and obtain contact information and then start messaging through those, because you think it's a safe community, and we're trying to create a safe community. But again, just because somebody seems to be part of your church, if you don't know, or whatever the community is, but if you don't actually know them in real life, we want to be extra careful. I had one case in particular where a lot of these elements came together. It was a young teenage girl who was part of an online fan club for a very popular music group. And one of the other, so she didn't know all of the people who were in that fan club. And one of the other kids, or at least pretend kids, reached her, and they started an online relationship. And she was somebody who was desperate for affection and attention. And so she now has this boyfriend that she's never met in real life. She thinks the boyfriend is legit because they've connected over this band. It seems pretty innocuous. It wasn't a dating site. It wasn't anything that looked predatory. And they had common friends in real life. So this person online was connected to people she knew in real life. And then some of the things I described earlier on started happening. He didn't actually need to ask her tell her to take nude photographs of herself because he created different identities and locked her out of one of her accounts somehow. He had some cyber skills, and he was able to get her password to her account and then post things that looked like her. She got expelled from school. He posed as the boyfriend and then another person. So he had like the good guy, bad guy going on. And this other person started making threats to the boyfriend. If you don't now take these pictures, if you don't now do this and this and this. And so, and then posted the pictures on her account. And she was expelled from school. Nobody believed her when she actually told the truth about the situation. But this was one of my cases when I was an agent. We received information from the other side and were able to come in and talk to her and reveal the truth of the situation. But it's this slippery slope, right? And this person looked safe. So that's where our kids don't like the rules if we tell them you can't be talking to somebody that you don't know in real life. But that's the only way to protect completely from that sort of conduct. So that's pretty restrictive. I think at certain stages that is right. As we start to become less restrictive as kids are getting older, and we know, right, many of us have a professional presence online, but there are things we don't talk about online. There are things that we don't post because those create vulnerabilities. And so again, it's not, I'm gonna be on, I always say the same soapbox. It's messy. It's not the simple. It's not just the list of red flags, watch for this and then don't do this. It's the everyday walking alongside and teaching kids to make the good decisions and trying to protect them from those vulnerabilities.
Can I also maybe ask or add something to that? Because kind of like what you were saying about the narratives and stuff, I don't think now, I actually have a child on the way, so I'm going through these scenarios in my head on how I'm going to handle it when I get to that stage. But yeah, I don't want to necessarily create like a scary picture of the world, but also with these vulnerabilities in mind and like the potential risks, one of my things that I keep thinking of is like, don't post pictures of, say, for example, even if you're a working person, don't post pictures with your company logo in the background or maybe your school's logo in the background, because if someone's there, they know where to find you and then they can, work their way in. So how can I say, advice would you have for how we could potentially not restrict, but advise our children on the content that they might post on social media?
Well, again, it's got to be age specific. There's stuff I hate that it's just out there for the world about my children. And I had to make that decision, as you said, are you going to teach them fear as a trafficker tactic? So we can use it with good motivations. We need to delineate between what is fear and what is wisdom. We can't safely eliminate every risk, which that doesn't seem to make sense at all, but it is the reality, because if we work too hard to eliminate the dangers, as I said, humans are wired for connection, and we are going to cause our kids to be unhealthy. If they're in any sort of activity at all, if they're in sports as they get older, all of these things, those are often online, and that's the reality. I had another case that was like that, where there was a predator who pretended to be, it was a much older man, pretended to be a teenage girl, and just looked at the media coverage of some sports teams. These teenage boys, was able to come in from the one and just identify these kids, and they were exploited. And in fact, the parents didn't believe it. How could this have even happened to they were some of the most popular, successful kids in school, but they were vulnerable to that false narrative. And so what would have prevented it? Maybe having those conversations. And again, if you're going to watch everything they're doing online. You can do that at early stages. There comes a point where, depending how many children you have and how busy you are and how busy they are, that's going to be really tough to do. There's some really practical things that you can do. I have actually, if I can maybe provide it to you later, I think we're going to post it on one of our websites. I have a friend from the Bureau who wrote up a contract for his kids before they were given a device or access online. These are the things that we're agreeing to. It's much easier if you do that before they have technology in their hands than after. Well, let me just say, despite being the expert, there are some things I learned as I went along. There's cautions that I could give to parents in all my spiels, but when it came to the reality, those things didn't necessarily work. So I'm not giving you those things today because they don't work. Like, let's be practical about it. But establishing those expectations from the beginning so they agree to it, I will tell you if X, Y, or Z happens, that they're agreeing to that. That they're agreeing to, if you, one of those things you're going to put in place is, I'm not going to talk to anybody I don't know in real life. Establishing hours that they can be online and take the device. One of the most dangerous places your child can be is alone in their bedroom with an internet connected device. And so, I mean, when COVID came and the world shut down, I thought our kids are in more danger than ever. And that's what we saw, because that's where our kids went. And we required them to go there to do school. We required them to go be isolated on an internet connected device. So the best advice I can give you is don't do that. Don't send them to that place. You can start out with putting, we got portable computers, but I mean, what are your rules going to be about that? There is monitoring software. There is software that you can get to alert you to certain things. It is helpful. It's not foolproof. So we can try to combat technology with technology. There are really helpful tools, but it's always going to come back to what are the trafficker tactics? And how are we teaching our children not to be vulnerable to those things?
Yeah, I like that idea of the setting up a contract before. Maybe I'm not sure if everyone's necessarily familiar with all of some of or maybe like a lot of the tactics and stuff. So maybe just touching on a few of the red flags or something like that they could be on the lookout for, besides the ones that you mentioned with the whole isolation and all of that. Like, how would you as a parent recognize if your child has got an area which you might have to have one of those difficult conversations, or they're at a stage where you need to have one of those difficult conversations with them?
Yeah. For me, the number one thing is any relationship that becomes isolating and controlling is something we want to get them out of immediately. Now, the challenge is, depending on the age of your children, they might not listen to you. And that is where it is so important to have other people. It didn't matter that I was an expert. It didn't matter that the FBI said I was an expert. It didn't matter that I was going into my children's school and giving the talks. Mom didn't know anything. When somebody else said it, I hope my kids don't watch this later. But having those other folks to recognize those things, and it may even be that, if you're coming from the perspective of a parent, you see the isolation, you see the control, you can have the conversation with your child. It's not probably going to be an instant conversation. It's going to be a walking alongside them. It's going to be asking them good questions so that they identify and recognize for themselves. They're going to have to think about it, and they're going to have to recognize and be empowered. This is where, just like it's not the sudden abduction typically. Very rarely is it the sudden when somebody is trafficked or in a situation of being exploited or groomed. That also is very rarely the sudden rescue. It's something that happens over the course of time. So situations often degrade. When you recognize manipulation, when you recognize isolation, when you recognize control. If your child has always been a pretty happy, joyful, bubbly person, and suddenly they're withdrawing, something's wrong. If they're not spending time with their friends anymore, if they're just spending time with one friend, or they're only going to one place, then those are red flags. Those aren't the red flags you typically get on the checklist. The checklists don't usually work. It's why we're missing it so frequently. So I know I haven't given easy solutions, but the hard news is there aren't any.
No, I think you provided pretty good advice. I'm definitely going to take it to heart.
Any other questions?
Yes, good evening, Suzanne. You're speaking to Genevieve. I'm from the media. I just have one question to ask. Just last week we did an article on child pornography, and there's been an increase, according to the Film and Publications Board, in the last 6 months. A lot of cases linked to how children are actually lured via the internet. Are you able to comment on the fact that the child trafficking technique is kind of changing now? Obviously, as children have more access to the internet, but children actually don't have to leave their home to be trafficked. As you mentioned, one incident involving someone who pretended to be someone else. There's a lot of those incidents that we have locally, seeing grown men creating profiles, being a 12-year-old or 13-year-old, and creating groups even. So the physical part of it is kind of taken away, where child can be trafficked right in front in the bedroom, sending naked pictures of themselves and stuff like that. Would you say that this is kind of a trend right now, where there's a change from a child being physically taken from your home?
A part of your question I didn't hear, so if I don't answer you completely, please ask again. But the part about being a trend, for as long as there's been photography, there's probably been child pornography. It exploded, the trading of it, I believe, with the creation of the internet. That's really where I started working. The child exploitation was the online child exploitation and the production and trade of child pornography. It's very closely connected with trafficking. That's what shifted me into investigating trafficking. And there's such a nexus between pornography and human trafficking so often. I mean, folks have said there's no way to have certain statistics regarding human trafficking. There's just no way, because we're coming from the outside and trying to look at an unknown number. But there have been surveys of groups of victims of trafficking that have been done where 100% have said there's been pornographic images created of them. So it's something that happens in the course of their being trafficked, but it's also something that happens to induce them, to extort them, to force them, coerce them into then the physical acts. You could actually have trafficking without, what we often think of as sex trafficking, being the person who's going out and meeting with customers and their sex after sex act. But even that, if it's a commercial transaction, if anything of value is exchanged for that image of a child, then that can actually be sex trafficking. In fact, here in the States, what law enforcement have failed to recognize is there's a federal law where there's a 30-year penalty. So it's 3 times the mandatory minimum for child sex trafficking or production of child pornography if you obtain a child for the purpose of producing child pornography, because it's this intersection of the two that's seen as so egregious. There was a recent investigation, I think it's still ongoing, down in Texas, that's received some attention, of a facility that was built, I'm told, to serve trafficking victims, but there were some allegations that staff were taking pictures, or their devices being used to take pictures of children, and that there were potentially drugs exchanged in payment for that. And there was some debate over whether there was child abuse and whether there was trafficking. And there were some folks in the government in fairly high positions of power who, given those facts, said there's no evidence of trafficking or child abuse. And I looked at that and went, okay, but the federal violation, the penalty is 3 times what it would be for either offense individually that you're saying doesn't exist. So those are the sorts of things that horrify me. The abuse horrifies me. The trafficking horrifies me. And then the fact that those who are leading the movement and making decisions, I don't think this is isolated to the United States, aren't educated and equipped with the information that they need to make good decisions, to prosecute the offenses, or to develop the programs. And in fact, the programs are at times doing harm, I don't think intentionally, but falling prey to some of those trafficker tactics and the false narrative. And so it is so complicated. It is so messy. There's intersection in many ways between the pornography and the trafficking. And, you know, thank you as a member of the media for asking the questions and telling the stories in a more in-depth way, because we try to often simplify it. And I would love to be able to simplify it, but it's not simple unless we simplify it to say evil is a force. It's a force in this world. Evil's weapon is deception, and we're in a war against evil. So folks will say we're in a war against trafficking. Okay, but really we're in a war against evil. Trafficking is the story of all of time. As a person of faith, I go back to the beginning, and as snake slithered up to a woman, this is the story that I've been taught. Slithered up to a woman and took the truth off track. All of humanity fell into captivity spiritually. Trafficking, that's what trafficking is. It's in the physical. It's the truth being taken a little off track. And that's how people are taken into this captivity of sex trafficking, human trafficking. So I'm going to toss it back to Caitlin, because I told you I do that sometimes. I just go down the rabbit trails. I'm not sure whether I answered the question because I didn't hear the full question, but I'm very passionate about the need to address the child pornography. It's not just pictures, which people often say. The pictures are often produced in the course of trafficking. The production can be part of the trafficking, and they can be used to induce trafficking.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can also maybe add to that. In terms of South African law, we only have to, so the 3 elements would be like restriction of movement, for example. So they would take say identity documents or something like that, force and coercion, or moving someone across borders, like that's more for obviously cross-border trafficking. However, with children, only one of those elements need to be present for an act of to be considered trafficking. So obviously force and coercion, like you were saying, there's intent. So the intent is to get these images to be able to exploit the child or to make a profit. So that's that's kind of where I think it's maybe more relevant in terms of South Africa for what you were saying. And there has been definitely an increase, I think, in the proliferation of child pornography in the country. Trafficking overall has increased in my from what I've experienced anyways on my end quite significantly, and we are one of the hotspots in the world for that. So I think as you were saying as well, as children are getting more and more connected, and as more people are getting devices and are connecting, we're going to see a rise in it if there aren't steps taken to prevent or to educate individuals about these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dave.
Hi, Suzanne. I think it will be the last question for the night before Kathleen comes in. I'm having talk in the next few coming days, and as I was compiling the presentation, one of the things that I came across was that when it comes to adolescents and teenagers, it is that are having boyfriends who are trafficking them. It is difficult to get them open up and share their stories because they are in love. And I'm anticipating that some of those questions will actually come up in the prevention talk that is coming. So I don't know if you have any sort of advice that you could share with us on how to really advise the adolescents and teenagers that are in relationships, especially with older boyfriends that are spoiling them and leading them to do things that are not appropriate.
Right. Yeah, that's so often what it looks like. And it is hard if we haven't taught children to avoid those relationships from the get-go. It is really hard to get somebody out of that place because they feel such a bond and such strong affection, and they don't recognize that person as a trafficker. And that's where it's something that finding freedom from that sort of situation is something that happens over the course of time. When you have somebody who has so longed for affection, and now a person has come in and is meeting that need, or what they've felt was in need, they're probably not going to break away unless somebody else comes in, and it probably needs to be many somebodies. And that need is then being met in a healthy way. We can argue with the facts, and sometimes that works, but emotions are a very, very strong thing. And that's a complex situation. And it's probably not one conversation. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversations. And when you're looking at something up close, it's a lot harder to see. So often, trafficking will manifest as something else, as we talked about in the beginning, where it looks like domestic violence. It looks like abuse within a relationship, a particular relationship, where actually it's something much larger, and it is the trafficking. As the stories will often go, it's if you have a young girl, he does all these amazing, wonderful things for me. He loves me. He's the only person who loves me. I love him. Well, sometimes he gets angry. Sometimes he hits me. Well, he's not going to do it again. He's sorry. And if we're looking at that situation from a distance, we can see it for what it is. But when you're the person who's in that relationship, you believe the lie, right? Typically. And there's that trauma bond often that it doesn't make rational sense. But here's what we need to know if we're the parent, or we're the educator, or we're the person who's trying to step into that situation, even as we're trying to be the good guy, we're going to be portrayed as the bad guy if we come in and we try to disrupt that bond. And here's more of the mess of it. Control is a trafficker tactic. we cannot end trafficking using trafficker tactics. So if we come in and try to be too controlling in that situation rather than empowering to make good decisions and to choose to leave the relationship, that can be challenging too. Now, control, like I said, fear, wisdom, close, but not always the same. Control and accountability, I also believe, are not the same thing. So this is just like if you're going to give a child access to social media and devices, control and accountability are the same. It's much better if we can start for those who are expecting children versus already have them. But to know, we want to establish lines. Here's where the lines are. Here's what accountability looks like. We want to make ourselves safe to talk to. If a child does recognize that they're in a relationship that's unhealthy, or maybe they don't recognize it's unhealthy, but just be a safe place where they can talk. Because over the course of time, if we are patient and if we pray, I believe that's the most important piece. They'll get to that place of seeing what's healthy, seeing the unhealth, and walking away. And that's where we want to be ready to provide the support to do that. If we just come in and try to isolate and control, then it often doesn't work, and they just go from one situation to another abusive situation. I don't know if I answered your question.
You have. Thank you so much. I think one of the most tricky thing in this whole thing, for instance, in child-headed families, or in malfunctioning families where the father is not there, poor family backgrounds where there is no source of income, and then there is this particular uncle who comes in and becomes like the provider to the family. It's very difficult, because you find that's the person whom the kids look up to, only to find out he is actually the trafficker. So I'm trying to imagine those kind of situations. How do you really convince this mother that this uncle is actually
and what's the alternative? We need to, as a community, we need to provide the alternative. So you're getting to another one of my soapboxes. You're talking about the individual situation. But what I'll say so often is we focus so narrowly on trafficking that we miss it so often. There is a need to identify and respond to trafficking, but as a community, we need to address the root issues. We need to address poverty, hunger, the need for education, why our kids are feeling anxious and isolated, because poverty can be a vulnerability. But kids were trafficked from the most wealthy of neighborhoods too. We need to address childhood sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. All of these things make kids vulnerable. And so as a community, one organization, one person can't do it all. So here in the States, we have a lot of anti-trafficking organizations that are popping up and trying to do all of the things. We have organizations who, one of our great vulnerabilities is addiction and drugs being used to cause people to become dependent. And there's actually case law here that the withdrawal, people will think literally the pain of withdrawal, that it will kill them. And so there's been case law that has been established where that is actually sufficient for the force and coercion in trafficking. So we have to address the addiction, and people don't just go out one day and decide to get addicted to drugs also. Like there's something that caused that. And so I think the positive, another one of the positives happening right now that we're talking about trafficking is the community's recognizing it. This is something we care about. Now what we have to recognize is it really takes the entire community engaging across the spectrum, and we need coalitions. We need connected communities. Who's addressing housing? Who's addressing education? And get them to the table, because often there's redundancies and there's gaps. And if you're to that mom and you're trying to convince her that this helper is actually exploiting or trafficking, what's the alternative? We need an alternative to her. So who is that alternative? And again, It shouldn't be one, it should be many. I've got that example in my backyard where we've got a lot of great services in our community. And I'm passionate about equipping communities around the globe. I'm particularly passionate about my own community, and I'm probably more connected here than in many places. We have all sorts of services that we offer. We have case plans, we have mental health solutions, we have housing, we have all of these things. We have one particular instance where, do you know what? It wasn't me, it was somebody I've worked with closely over the years, discovered. They live in the city. There's not a grocery store next door. There's not a place to get food unless you travel a little bit to get it, and you've got to ride the bus maybe 2 hours to get there. And if you're going to work to provide for your child and then trying to get your child all the services that she needs to recover from the exploitation, you don't have time to ride the bus 2 hours to go to the store every day. There was a refrigerator that's like this big. That's all they have. The child's hungry. Root issue. We can't do all of the other things. It's not that that child needed to be removed and taken somewhere else. The family needed a refrigerator. So those are the things that we as a community, we haven't addressed all the things because we found out she needed a refrigerator. I don't think there was anybody who was in the business of providing, nor does there need to be. But you see what I'm saying? It's then let's look at what do we offer? Because we can tell that mom all day long that the way that she's getting by is not okay, but she doesn't have an alternative until we meet that root need. So it's such a good question, and it really, to me, highlights the need for community engagement and for us to not just have the conversation and dedicate resources to whatever's in front of us, but to really identify the needs in our local communities and then to connect the resources with that need so that she has a practical answer.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Dave Reed, you had a question? Or you put your hand up?
Yeah, I did. We've kind of moved on a bit, but I'll take it back. We were talking about child pornography, and sorry, just a bit of my context. So I'm a safeguarding and child protection consultant for schools in South Africa, and was exposed to most of that as some of the work I did in Cambodia and Southeast Asia. So just the question I have with that, one of them, and maybe it's really just what is the latest development in terms of law and protection in the space of child pornography, particularly with the engagement of generative AI and deepfakes. So we've had a couple of people going onto school profiles, social profiles, taking photographs of people and then generating pornographic and using that for extortion. So I don't know, Suzanne, what your engagement with that is, but it's a new thing that we try.
Right. Well, I don't know what it would be in your jurisdiction. I believe we've had some recent clarification here in the States, which I never thought we needed, because even when I was an agent in investigating child pornography, we could pursue the investigation. If the intent was to portray a child, then we could pursue the charges just the same. If we were charging for, the prosecutor's office would have some, like, there were some technicalities. I'm not an attorney, but what I recall from doing those investigations, even before there was additional clarification, and the challenge, right, is it going to hold up on appeals? But when I was doing the investigations, there were already folks who were generating through digital capabilities. It wasn't as advanced as it is now, but it was still illegal and it was still exploitation. And I believe there will be some additional laws coming that will provide new tools to pursue that as well. But me on my soapbox still and again, but law enforcement can't do it all, as you know, because this is so off the hook. We don't have enough law enforcement on the planet to prosecute, investigate all of the instances of exploitation. We don't have, the law enforcement need more resources, but this piece, this prevention piece is key because it is so incredibly prolific. And I don't mean to be discouraging with that, but sometimes we'll get frustrated with law enforcement and they need more education. We all need more education. We need more connection. We need to learn from one another. We need the equipping, and we need to recognize that we're all just mere mortals doing the best we can with what we have. And I think this conversation moves us forward in the prevention. So I'm grateful for all of you and what you do and the opportunity to talk, and I hope continue the conversation from here.
Any other questions from anyone else? All right, then I am going to close us off. Just want to say thank you so much, Suzanne, for making the time just to talk to us, share your stories, share some of your expertise. I made lots of notes. I've been like, oh, this would be good as an inspiration for a post or things like that. So, and I'm sure everyone else can also agree with me that it was very informative and also just insightful. And I think obviously a lot of us have learned of some of the other ways that traffickers are using and implementing and their tricks. Yeah, and just how to keep our children safe, our future children, our children in the making safe. Yeah. So just thank you so much from us here at Brave.
Thank you.
And just thank you everyone for taking the time out of your evening or your wherever you are based, your evening, your morning, your afternoon, just to hop on this Zoom call. Yeah, please go and share what you've learned, and just I really trust that we will then make a difference.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I also think if you guys have any other suggestions or things that you're perhaps interested in, maybe you could comment on our Facebook page or any of our other social media platforms, just so that we can maybe try and cater to what you guys want to see and what you guys want to hear about. And then hopefully we can host something again like this in the future.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Hope you have a great evening. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. You. Bye.